I'm a wishy-washy lefty progressive, which means I'm, for the most part, fairly pacifist in my orientations. But an event happened recently which kind of attracted my attention, and clearly a lot of other people's attention, which is the very public punching of Richard Spencer, the neo-Nazi. And it was fascinating, but it's not so much the action itself was fascinating, although certainly some of the video remixes were pretty funny, but the kind of cultural and social impact that act is having, I think, is really interesting. And it got me thinking about punching, and it got me thinking about violence and my attitudes towards it and the kind of language around it. And you know, watching a bunch of videos and been doing a lot of reading about it recently, kind of coming out of that. I mean, the first thing I'm thinking of is about, you know, what the role of violence is. There's a quote from one of Isaac Asimov's novels, which is that violence is the last resort of the incompetent. And I remember when I came across that, and that made a lot of sense to me. And I know that even though it comes out of one of the mouths of one of the characters in Asimov's novel, I think he himself cited it and quoted it as one of the principles at which he lives by. And that's quite interesting, because I've always thought that quote meant that you know, violence is the last resort of the incompetent, is that, you know, incompetent people will eventually run out of ideas, and they'll probably run out of ideas about how to respond to a situation fairly quickly, and then they'll resort to violence because they just don't have the intellectual resources to be able to come up with alternatives. So they resort to the last resort fairly quickly. They're incompetent people. But there's some ambiguity around it, isn't there, that idea? Which is that just thinking what that means, violence is the last resort of the incompetent. I mean, the alternative kind of interpretation of it might be that if you're incompetent in terms of, you know, your understanding of the way the world operates, the understanding of how different people engage with the world, if you're not very creative, whatever it may be, that if you're incompetent, you might have this kind of heuristic, a rule of thumb that you live by, which just says, I'm anti-violence, I don't do violence, so you just leave it until it's inevitable that you're going to be violent. Whereas a competent person might not leave it that long. They might realise really early on in any kind of encounter that really the only way to respond is violently. And don't waste time trying out methods that won't work. Don't waste time trying to get involved in some kind of discussion which is clearly going to go nowhere, and which will probably end up in themselves being the subject of a violent attack, whatever it may be. So in that kind of interpretation, violence is the last resort of the incompetent, because competent people get violent quicker because they know when it's appropriate to be violent and when there is no alternative sooner. So I don't know, I'm entertaining that as a thought, and I'll perhaps come back to that at the end, actually, because I'm also thinking about this, the punch itself, this very specific example of violence. Because the trouble with violence is that it's generalised, and we tend to produce, I mean, all the arguments, the simpler arguments, the best I've seen about Richard Spencer being punched have been, broadly speaking, kind of Kantian, categorical imperative type arguments. They haven't called themselves that. But that version is a categorical imperative, which is that you should always behave as if your actions were a universal law, which is that if one person's allowed to do it, then everybody should be allowed to do it. It should be just a standard. So that's the kind of response, you know, that if it's okay for Richard Spencer to be punched when he's saying something unpopular, then everybody can be punched when somebody finds their words unpopular. It's a kind of Kantian thing. But it's not the only way of looking at it, is it? There's other ways of looking at that action which I think frame it a little bit differently. I mean, first off, looking at the action itself, it's just a punch. I don't wish to trivialise punching, but it is something that happens a lot. In the small town where I live, really small town, Friday and Saturday night, people get punched occasionally. It just happens. And as I say, that's a very small town. And that happens in every town, in every county, in every country in the world, I suspect. People just get punched a lot. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it happens, and for the most part people get over it. Not wanting to trivialise it, that is the case. I wouldn't like it if it happened to me. It has happened to me, but not for years. Didn't like it, but I've completely got over it. So, you know, and since I don't lie awake in bed at night, you know, just fretting about all these people getting punched, if I don't do that, then I'm certainly not going to lose any sleep if a neo-Nazi gets punched. That just seems disproportionate to the situation. And I suspect Richard Spencer would probably feel the same way. I'm sure if he was asked, he could probably think of the worst things that could have happened. And by all appearances at least, doesn't seem to be suffering physically in any great way. Seems to have been, if not chastened, then at least that his mind changed about how he behaves in public. But that's a different thing, isn't it? So, again, just to repeat, not trivialising it, but also, like, keep it in proportion. Somebody got punched, and people get punched all the time, so it's not that important. Having said that, I think on another level, it's really important and really interesting, because this is a particular punch, you know, very different from the punches that happen in my local town and every other town around the world. It was a punch that happened to one particular person at one particular time during this demonstration. Even whilst he's in the middle of a particular sentence, you know, he's like talking about this frog pin he's wearing, Pepe's a frog pin. It was punched by a particular individual, and of course it was caught on camera. So it's not the same as every other punch, it has specific characteristics. And in this particular case, the characteristics that it has, you know, person, place, you know, the subject, all the contextual things around it, and particularly the fact that it was filmed, means that it's operating differently. It's become a symbolic action. It isn't just a physical action, which, as I say, I think is relatively trivial in the great scheme of things. It's a symbolic action. It has symbolic significance wider than its physical existence. Now it remains to be seen exactly what the fallout from that, of that symbolism, if you like, will be. But one of the things that I've noticed, and I may be wrong here, but this is something that I've noticed, is that people like myself, people who are broadly speaking pacifists, broadly speaking progressives, you know, lefties, I guess, not militant lefties, not but you know, people like myself who are anti-violence. For a long time after the election, and particularly after the inauguration, a lot of us felt a little bit bereft, a little bit abandoned, a little bit unsure of how to respond. You know, the tools that we're used to, all those other strategies we use to counter what we see as toxic, reasoned debate, proper functioning democracies, truth-telling, telling truth to power, all those kind of strategies just didn't seem to be working anymore. And then this one act, just one guy in a black balaclava landing Richard Spencer across the jaw with his elbow on film just seems to have made a difference. There just seems to be a what's that expression in Star Wars? A disturbance in the force. There seems to have been a bit of disturbance in the force. People seem a little bit more energised by it. I don't think people are being more violent. No one's saying, well, we should all go out and punch Nazis now. I don't think saying that. But they're very happy to lose that language more. They can use the images of that. Lots of images of old comics of Superman punching a Nazi or Wonder Woman punching him. All those things are coming to the fore. The visual language of violence is more available. And the spoken language of violence, not the actions itself. I haven't seen any increases in actual violence. And willingness to dismiss stupid arguments. A willingness to recognise that there are alternatives to reasoned discourse, and there are alternatives than just speaking truth to power, or just trying to take the moral high ground in all situations. That there's a kind of energy from not literal violence, but the kind of symbolic acceptance of violence as the terminal point in conversations. So as I say, I don't see people from the left, progressives, actually being more violent, but I see something of the essence of a recognition of violence and its place as being more, as giving them a kind of power. People seem more resilient. Maybe I'm dreaming. That's just the way it looks to me. Just one last thing about violence. I'm maybe way off mark here. I think I probably am, but it's worth a shot. One of the features of being a pacifist or resisting violence and not wanting to get into that kind of whole terrain of violence, resisting even the language of violence sometimes, which I think people like myself have done for forever really, is that it makes you appear soft. And that's true. But violence, as I say, isn't one of these, it doesn't just exist within categorical imperative or other kinds of philosophical arguments. It's a personal thing. And the personal aspects of violence are something that almost all of us have got. I mean, I know there are some things which would provoke me to violence, and I haven't been violent for decades, I haven't hit anybody for decades, but I know that there are some things which would make me violent. You know, an assault on a loved one or a friend or somebody close to me, which would surely do it. And probably less than that. I could certainly be moved to violence. And very few people, I think, would not be moved to violence under any circumstances. There's always a line we cross. And it may be, I don't know if this is true, it may be that people like myself call ourselves pacifists, talk the language of non-violence, talk the language of acceptance and speaking truth to power and the power of discourse and rationality and all that kind of stuff. It may be that we resort to violence, if I can go back to resorting, it may be that we take longer to resort to violence. It may be that we don't enter that discourse as early as some other people. We don't feel quite as comfortable with it. Even using the words we don't feel comfortable with. So we don't get involved lightly. But history seems to suggest that people like, not like me, but progressives tend to win. I'm just reminded of the 1939-45 conflict that took place across most of Europe and the rest of the world. Countries which were espousing the values of non-violence were fairly loath to get involved, came late to the game. America didn't join until 41 when its own boundaries had been crossed with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and something finally triggered that response. But all of us, we whooped the Nazis' arse, didn't we really? So a reluctance to be involved early isn't really a sign of weakness. It might be a sign of a discomfort with the actuality and the language and the images of violence. But it doesn't denote weakness, I don't think. Violence is the last resort of the incompetent. I believe that's a pastiche or a remake of a Ben Jonson. Is it Ben Jonson? Dr. Johnson, who wrote the dictionary anyway, that guy. The guy who wrote the dictionary who was talking about patriotism. He said patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. Patriotism, the last refuge of the scoundrel.